The morning air was cold, and the streets were crowded with people rushing to work, shops, and buses. Among them, a small boy walked slowly, carrying a violin that was older than he was. Its wooden body was scratched and worn, but he held it carefully, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. His shoes were torn, his clothes were patched in several places, and his stomach ached with hunger. He had not eaten since the night before, and every step felt heavier than the last. Still, he kept moving, determined to reach the busy street corner that had become his stage. The boy's name didn't matter to most people. To the adults hurrying past him, he was just another street child, someone to ignore or, at most, pity. But to him, the violin was more than an instrument. It was a friend, a companion, and a hope that maybe, just maybe, life could be a little better if he played his music. He had learned by listening to others on the radio, in cafes, and in the rare concerts he could sneak into. Every note he played had a story, even if no one else could hear it. When he reached the street corner, he took a deep breath and set down a small cardboard sign. On it, in messy handwriting, he had written, "I'll play for a piece of food." It was simple, honest, and brave all at once. He knew it might sound strange, maybe even ridiculous, but it was the only way he could get something to eat that day. He had no money, no one to give him food, and the cupboards at home were empty. He lifted his violin and drew the bow across the strings. At first the sound was hesitant, uneven, almost shy. He could feel the eyes of a few people glancing at him as they passed, some with curiosity, most with indifference. A man in a dark coat shook his head and muttered something under his breath. A woman with a stroller hurried past, pulling her child along, clearly thinking he was a nuisance. A few teenagers laughed, pointing at his torn shoes and his old violin, whispering jokes that were loud enough for him to hear. At first, he wanted to cry. He wanted to drop the violin and run home, embarrassed and defeated. Hunger gnawed at him, and the laughter of strangers felt like it cut deeper than any cold wind. But then he reminded himself why he was there. He wasn't just playing for food. He was playing because music was part of him. It was the thing that kept him going when everything else felt impossible. If he could make just one person stop and listen, maybe, just maybe, things would start to change. He closed his eyes for a moment and began again. This time he let his fingers move naturally, letting the music flow as if it were coming from somewhere deep inside. The notes were soft at first, trembling like the morning fog over the street. Then slowly they grew stronger, richer, more confident. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was a story. It was the story of a boy who was hungry, scared, and alone, yet refusing to give up. It was the story of hope in a world that often seemed hopeless. Some people paused, curious despite themselves. A shopkeeper leaning on the doorframe watched, his expression unreadable. A delivery man stopped mid-step, listening for a few seconds before shaking his head and continuing. But still, there were no coins, no bread, no recognition. The boy's stomach growled again, and he felt the sharp edge of despair. He almost gave up, almost told himself that music would not feed him today. But the violin was in his hands, and something inside him refused to let go. Minutes turned into an hour. The morning passed with its usual rush, the streets filled with faces that didn't care, but the boy kept playing. Each note carried his determination, his hunger, and his dreams. Sometimes his bow slipped, producing a squeak instead of a melody, and he winced, but he didn't stop. He knew that mistakes were part of learning, part of growing, part of proving to the world that he belonged. As the sun climbed higher, the shadows shifted and a few more people started noticing. A young woman stopped, adjusting her scarf, and for a moment she just listened. There was no rush in her steps, no dismissive glance. She looked at the boy, at the worn violin, at the sign, and something in her expression softened. She reached into her bag and pulled out a sandwich, dropping it gently into the open violin case. The boy's eyes widened in surprise. For the first time that morning, he had more than nothing. It wasn't a feast, but it was enough to quiet the hunger gnawing at his stomach. Enough to remind him that some people could see beyond the torn clothes and tired face to the music itself. Encouraged, he played with more energy, letting the bow dance across the strings. The sound changed. It became lively, full of joy and gratitude. He imagined himself in a grand concert hall, playing for hundreds of people, not just for scraps of food. But for now, the street corner was his stage, and even this small audience mattered. Some people slowed down to listen, some smiled, some tossed a coin or two. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. As the day wore on, he noticed something remarkable. The more he played, the more people started to stop. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was fascination. Children pressed their faces against shop windows, pointing and whispering to their parents. Adults lingered for longer than they intended, caught by the melody of the boy's violin. Some even took out their phones, recording short videos, sharing them with friends. The laughter and mockery that had greeted him in the morning faded into the background. For a few moments, the boy was no longer invisible, no longer just a hungry child on the street. He was a musician, a storyteller, a spark of something extraordinary. By the afternoon, the violin case was no longer empty. Coins, bills, and pieces of food filled it. But more than that, he felt something he had not felt before: respect. People were beginning to understand that he was not there to beg, not there to annoy them, but there to share a gift. Each note was a tiny rebellion against the world that had treated him as nothing. Each melody was a declaration that he existed, that he mattered, that his dreams were real. Still, the boy knew this was only the beginning. Hunger would return, the streets would remain crowded and indifferent, and he would have to come back again tomorrow and the day after. But now he had hope, and hope was stronger than hunger. Hope was stronger than laughter. And hope was stronger than despair. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the street, the boy packed up his violin. His stomach was no longer empty, his heart no longer heavy. He carried the case home, thinking about the next day, about the notes he would play, about the people he might touch with his music. In the cold, noisy streets, among the rushing, uncaring crowd, one small boy had found a way to shine. He had played for a piece of food, yes, but he had gained so much more than anyone could measure. That night, as he lay on his thin mattress, listening to the distant sounds of the city, he closed his eyes and dreamed of a world where music could change everything. And in that quiet moment, he knew that no matter what anyone said, no matter how hungry or tired he became, he would never stop playing. The next morning, the boy woke up early as usual. The sky was still dark, and the streets were quiet except for the occasional sound of distant footsteps. He could feel the emptiness in his stomach, but he didn't let it slow him down. He packed his violin carefully, making sure it was safe, and grabbed the small cardboard sign he had made the day before. Today he would return to the same busy street corner. Maybe people would notice him again. Maybe they would stop and listen. As he walked through the narrow alleyways, he noticed the usual sights of his world. Broken bicycles leaned against walls, stray cats darting between crates, and the smell of bread baking in small shops. Even in this simple, rough world, he saw beauty if he looked closely enough. The boy had learned to notice little things, little moments that others ignored. The glimmer of sunlight on a puddle, the rhythm of people's footsteps, the soft chirping of birds above the rooftops. All of it could become music if he played it right. When he reached the corner, he placed his sign on the ground and began to play. But this morning, the street felt different. The people walking past were the same, busy and hurried, but their expressions were harder this time. Some glanced at him with annoyance, muttering complaints about how he took up space or blocked their path. A man in a suit shook his head, frowning at the boy as if he were an obstacle to the world. A group of teenagers threw mocking smiles at him, whispering jokes that cut sharper than the cold wind. The boy felt a pang of shame. He wanted to disappear, to hide his violin and run away. Hunger clawed at his stomach again, and for a moment he thought about giving up entirely. Maybe today was not his day. Maybe the world was too cruel, too impatient, too harsh to understand someone like him. But then he remembered the small act of kindness from yesterday, the sandwich someone had left in his case. That one small gesture reminded him that the world was not entirely heartless. Somewhere out there, someone would see him for who he really was, and his music could reach them, he lifted his violin and began to play again. At first, the notes were hesitant, trembling with the cold and his fear. But soon the music grew stronger, richer, and more confident. He poured all of his feelings into each melody, the hunger, the loneliness, the hope, and the determination. It was a language no one could misunderstand. Even if they ignored him at first. As he played, he noticed a few people slowing down. A young woman, carrying a basket of groceries, paused for a moment. She didn't smile, but she listened. An older man, leaning on his cane, stopped and tilted his head, clearly caught by the melody. Even the group of laughing teenagers hesitated, their whispers fading as the music drew them in. The boy felt a small spark of hope light up inside him, but the street was still not kind. A man with a harsh voice shouted at him to move aside. "You're in the way. Stop wasting everyone's time." The boy flinched but didn't stop playing. Instead, he let the anger and fear fuel his music. Each note became sharper, more expressive, carrying the story of someone who would not give in to the cruelty around him. People began to notice the intensity, the raw emotion, the skill hidden behind the worn clothes and tired eyes. Minutes turned into hours, and slowly the mood of the street began to shift. The boy's music softened the harshness around him, even if only for a moment. Some people tossed coins or small pieces of food into his open violin case. Others simply paused, letting themselves feel the melody, letting themselves be transported from their busy lives into the world the boy created with his music. A little girl approached, her eyes wide with wonder. She had never seen anyone play like this before. She dropped a small coin into the case and whispered, "Thank you for the music." Her simple words made the boy's heart swell. He smiled at her, though his lips were chapped from the cold. That small act of recognition, that tiny spark of connection, reminded him why he kept playing. Music could reach people in ways words could not. It could bridge gaps, melt walls, and make strangers care. The hours passed, and by midday the boy had attracted a larger crowd. Some were curious, some were skeptical, but most were captivated. The laughter and mockery of yesterday were gone, replaced by a quiet attention. People began to recognize his talent for what it was, extraordinary. For a child so young, so small, to play with such emotion and skill was remarkable. Still, the boy was careful not to let it go to his head. He knew that the world could be unpredictable. One moment people could admire him, the next they could turn away, distracted by their own lives. He kept his focus on the music, on the connection it created, and on the tiny victories, the coin here, the piece of bread there. The nod of approval from someone who had stopped to listen. As the afternoon sun climbed high. A woman in a neat uniform stopped and leaned against a lamppost. She watched him carefully, her expression thoughtful. She didn't toss a coin or leave food immediately. Instead, she simply listened, letting the music wash over her. The boy didn't know it, but she was a music teacher. She had heard stories of a talented street musician, and now she was witnessing it herself. The depth and maturity in his playing were beyond what she expected from someone so young. She could see the potential in him. Hidden behind the tattered clothes and the small sign asking for food, the boy, sensing her attention, played even more earnestly. He wanted his music to speak, to tell its story, to reach hearts without needing words. Every bow across the strings became a plea, a message, a declaration that he existed, that he mattered, that his dreams were real. And slowly it began to work. People who had ignored him at first were now leaning closer, listening with rapt attention. Some took out phones to capture a video, some whispered to their friends, some simply stood still, letting the music fill the space around them. Despite the growing crowd, not everything was perfect. A few people still shouted, still pushed past, still mocked him. Hunger was still gnawing, and his small body ached from standing and carrying the violin all morning. But the boy had learned something important. The world might not always be kind, but his music gave him power. It gave him the ability to change how people felt, even for just a moment. It gave him hope when everything else seemed lost. By late afternoon, the boy's violin case was starting to fill with coins and food. The crowd had grown, and people were beginning to talk about him, pointing him out to others as they passed. Some even smiled, nodding their heads in approval. The boy felt a mix of pride and humility. Pride, because his music was finally being noticed, and humility because he knew this was just the beginning. There was still so much work to do, still so many days when he might go unnoticed or laughed at. As the sun began to lower, casting long shadows over the street, the boy finally paused. He packed his violin carefully and picked up the cardboard sign. The hunger in his stomach had eased slightly, but more importantly, the boy felt something new: respect. People were beginning to see him not just as a street child asking for scraps, but as a musician, a storyteller, a human being with dreams and talents. That evening, as he walked home, he thought about the day. The mocking laughter, the harsh words, and the indifference were still there in his memory, but they were outweighed by the small acts of kindness, by the faces that had paused to listen, by the coins and bread left in his case. He realized that even in a world that could be cruel, there were moments of connection, moments of understanding, moments when his music could make a difference. When he finally reached home, he placed the food on the table and set his violin down carefully. He felt a small sense of accomplishment, but he knew tomorrow would bring the same challenges. Hunger would return, the streets would still be crowded, and not everyone would understand or care. But he had learned a vital lesson: his music mattered. His determination mattered. And his dreams mattered. No matter how small or impossible they seemed, that night as he lay down to sleep, he imagined a future where his music could reach more people, where he could play not just for scraps of food but for audiences who understood the soul behind every note. He closed his eyes, letting the memory of the day sink in, the curiosity, the small kindnesses, the growing admiration. And as sleep overtook him, he knew one thing for certain: he would never stop playing, no matter how hungry, tired, or laughed at he became. Music was his life, his voice, and his hope, and it would carry him through anything the world threw his way. The next morning, the boy woke before sunrise. The streets were quiet, the city still rubbing its eyes and shaking off the sleep of the night. He held his violin carefully, its strings slightly worn, the wood polished from countless hours of practice and worry. He checked the bow and tightened it with care. Every morning began the same way: gather his courage, pick up the instrument, and walk to the street corner that had slowly become both stage and battlefield. Today felt different. The boy didn't know why. Perhaps it was the way the light filtered through the early mist, or maybe it was the small flicker of hope he carried after the reactions of the previous day. People had started to notice him, had begun to stop, listen, and sometimes even smile. That small recognition had given him a strange energy. It was still a struggle to walk with an empty stomach, but he felt a determination that went beyond hunger. When he arrived at the corner, he placed his cardboard sign carefully on the ground. "I'll play for a piece of food," it read. But the boy felt that today, the sign didn't fully describe what he was doing. He wasn't just asking for food. He was offering something precious: his music, his heart, his story. He drew the bow across the strings, and the first notes floated into the air. They were soft, cautious, almost shy, carrying the tension of early morning streets. People hurried past as usual, some ignoring him completely, some stealing quick glances. But slowly something began to happen. The melody seemed to linger. A few people slowed their steps. A man carrying a briefcase paused, frowning at first, then tilted his head, listening. A woman pushing a stroller stopped for a few moments, her eyes widening slightly. Even the children, usually fidgety and restless, were mesmerized, standing still as if hypnotized by the sound. The boy's confidence grew with each passing moment. His fingers moved with ease, his bow dancing across the strings with a fluidity that seemed almost magical. Each note carried not just the music he had practiced, but the emotion of a life full of struggle. Hunger, loneliness, fear, and hope, they all mingled in the sound, creating a melody that no one could ignore. It wasn't long before someone approached him. Someone who didn't just toss a coin or walk by. She was a woman in her 30s, neatly dressed, carrying a small notebook. She listened quietly, leaning against a lamppost, her eyes never leaving the boy. The boy noticed her attention and felt a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. He had played for people before, of course, but there was something about her that made him aware of every note, every movement. He wanted the music to speak to her, to tell his story without words. Minutes passed, and the woman finally smiled, not a casual smile, but one that reached her eyes. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small sandwich, dropping it gently into the open violin case. The boy's eyes widened in surprise and gratitude. The gesture was simple, yet it carried more meaning than anything else that day. Someone had recognized his effort, his talent, his humanity. Encouraged by her presence, the boy played with even more passion. The music became richer, more expressive, carrying the story of his struggles and dreams to anyone who was willing to listen. The notes floated above the street, wrapping around people like a gentle wind. For the first time, he noticed something extraordinary. Others began to gather, drawn not just by curiosity, but by admiration. A small crowd formed, people standing quietly, some with tears in their eyes, some simply smiling. Moved by the emotion in his playing, the woman with the notebook finally spoke. Her voice was gentle but full of authority. "You have a gift," she said. "A rare one. Have you ever studied music formally?" The boy shook his head, his small hands trembling slightly on the violin. "No, ma'am," he whispered. "I've only learned from listening, from practicing whenever I can." She nodded thoughtfully. "I would like to help you. I teach music. If you are willing, I could give you lessons, show you how to develop your talent." The boy froze for a moment, unsure if he had heard her correctly. Was this real? Could someone actually offer him a chance to learn, to grow, to rise beyond the streets and hunger? He nodded slowly, barely able to speak, feeling a mixture of disbelief, excitement, and hope. As the crowd watched silently, the woman introduced herself properly. She asked him questions about his life, his music, and his dreams. The boy spoke honestly, telling her everything he could. About the empty cupboards at home, the hours spent practicing in the alleyways, the ridicule he endured on the streets, and the small joys that music had brought him. She listened with attention and empathy, nodding and smiling at appropriate moments. By the end of their conversation, she had given him her card and arranged to meet him the next day for his first lesson. The boy's heart swelled with a mixture of excitement and fear. He had never imagined that his music could take him anywhere, that someone would take him seriously, that someone would care enough to invest in his future. For the first time, he felt a glimpse of possibility, a sense that his life could change. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving him with the sound of his own music echoing in the empty street. Coins and a few pieces of food still rested in his violin case, but they felt less important now. What mattered was the recognition, the opportunity, the validation of his talent. He realized that the struggle, the hunger, and the ridicule he had endured were part of a journey that was only beginning. As the day continued, he played for the remaining passers-by, but his mind often wandered to the lesson that awaited him. He imagined himself learning new techniques, mastering pieces he had only dreamed of, and performing in places far beyond the small street corner that had been his stage. The idea of growing beyond the streets, of sharing his music with more people, filled him with determination. That evening, as he walked home, the boy felt lighter despite the empty stomach and aching feet. The encounter with the woman had given him hope, a sense that he was not alone in the world, and that his music mattered. He thought about the other children on the streets, the ones who played games and ignored the world, and wondered how many hidden talents were out there, unseen and unheard. His own struggle had taught him to notice the small miracles, the little gestures that could change a life. At home, he carefully stored the violin and the small collection of coins and food. He ate what he could, savoring each bite, feeling grateful for the kindness of strangers and for the gift of music that had carried him through so many hard days. Then he practiced, as he always did, refining the notes, listening to the melodies, and imagining the possibilities that lay ahead. As night fell, he lay down on his thin mattress, listening to the sounds of the city outside, the distant voices, the rumble of traffic, the occasional bark of a dog. But his mind was full of music, of dreams, and of the promise of a new beginning. The woman's words echoed in his heart. "You have a gift. I want to help you. For the first time, he truly believed them. He closed his eyes and let the day's events sink in. The laughter of strangers, the small acts of kindness, the recognition of his talent, and the offer of guidance had all combined to create something powerful. He felt a sense of purpose growing inside him, a determination to work harder, to play better, to reach beyond the streets and the hunger that had shaped his life. As he drifted off to sleep, he dreamed not just of food or comfort, but of music-filling concert halls, of people listening with admiration and understanding, of a life where his talent was recognized and celebrated. The struggles of the streets, the hunger, and the ridicule were still part of his story, but they no longer defined him. His music, his courage, and his dreams were stronger, and he knew that tomorrow he would return to the streets not just for food, but to continue the journey that had begun with a simple violin and a boy's unshakable hope. The boy woke up that morning with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Today was not just another day on the streets. Today, he was going to meet the woman who had promised to teach him music. His heart pounded as he carefully packed his violin. For years, the violin had been both his friend and his companion through hunger and hardship. Now, it was also the key to a possible future he had only dared to imagine in dreams. Walking to the small music studio, his hands gripped the violin tightly. He kept replaying the woman's words in his mind. You have a gift. I want to help you. Those words had been like a lifeline thrown into a stormy sea. The boy had learned to survive through hunger and struggle, but real hope was something new, and it both thrilled and terrified him. When he arrived at the studio, he hesitated at the door. The building was small but bright, with posters of famous musicians on the walls and the faint smell of polished wood and sheet music. The woman greeted him warmly, sensing his nervousness, and led him to a room filled with instruments. The boy had never seen so many violins, music sheets, and tools to help him play better. It was overwhelming, but he didn't allow himself to be distracted. Today, he would learn, and he would prove that he deserved this chance. The lesson began slowly. She taught him about posture, how to hold the bow correctly, and the proper way to draw sound from the violin. At first, the boy struggled. His fingers were stiff, and his body was used to playing in a hurry on uneven streets without guidance. He made mistakes, producing squeaks and uneven tones, but the woman encouraged him with patience. Don't rush, she said. Every great musician started where you are. What matters is that you keep going. As the lesson continued, something remarkable happened. The boy, who had spent years learning on his own, began to understand the power of guidance. The woman showed him how to bring emotion into each note in a way that would touch people's hearts even more deeply. For the first time, the boy felt the difference between playing to survive and playing to communicate, to inspire, to shine. The music flowed differently now, richer, fuller, and more beautiful. By the end of the day, the boy was exhausted but exhilarated. He had learned more in a few hours than he had in months of practicing alone on the streets. The woman smiled at him, proud of his progress. You have more talent than most adults I've taught in years, she said. If you keep working hard, there's no limit to what you can achieve. Those words filled the boy with a new kind of determination. He had survived hunger, mockery, and loneliness, but now he had a future, a path that had once seemed impossible. Returning to the streets after his lesson, the boy noticed a change in himself. He walked taller, held his violin more confidently, and approached his usual street corner with a new sense of purpose. People still passed by without stopping, but he didn't mind. He no longer played just for food. He played because he loved it, because it was his voice, because it was the thing that made him feel alive. And something incredible began to happen. The crowd that gathered started to grow larger. Word had begun to spread about the boy with extraordinary talent, the one who had once played for scraps of food. People came out of curiosity at first, but soon they stayed to listen. The notes he played carried his story, and those who heard it could feel the struggle, the hope, and the talent in every sound. Children clutched their parents' hands, adults paused on their way to work, and even those who were hurried or impatient couldn't help but slow down to listen. Some of the older musicians in the city began to notice him too. They watched quietly from a distance, impressed by his skill and his dedication. One afternoon, a man approached, carrying a violin of his own. He introduced himself and asked if the boy would be willing to play together. The boy was nervous but agreed. When their violins met, the music seemed to transform. The harmony of two skilled players was breathtaking, and people stopped entirely to watch. Coins, notes, and applause filled the boy's case, but more importantly, the respect of those around him had grown. Despite the growing recognition, the boy remained humble. He remembered the days when people laughed at him, when hunger was constant, and when no one had believed in him. He knew that success could be fleeting and that every note he played was a choice and opportunity to share, to connect, and to honor the struggle that had brought him here. Each day he practiced with focus, not just for himself, but for the people who stopped to listen, for the woman who had taught him, and for every child who might one day follow in his footsteps. The woman continued to mentor him, offering lessons and guidance that went beyond technique. She taught him how to perform in front of crowds, how to control his nerves, and how to express stories through music. She encouraged him to imagine the lives of those who listened, to make each note resonate with meaning. Under her guidance, the boy's playing became more than just skill, it became art, a way to move hearts and inspire minds. One day, as the boy played on the street, a man in a suit stopped and listened for an unusually long time. After the boy finished, the man approached. "You have something special," he said. "I manage events where talented musicians perform. Would you like to play in a small concert?" The boy was stunned. He had never imagined anything like this. Playing on the street was survival. Playing in a concert was a dream he had not dared to dream yet. But the woman nodded encouragingly, and the boy agreed. Feeling both nervous and thrilled, the days that followed were filled with preparation. The boy practiced tirelessly, incorporating the lessons he had learned and experimenting with new melodies. He felt nervous but determined. Every note, every bow stroke, every breath was part of a journey that had begun on a cold, crowded street corner. He knew that this opportunity could change everything, and he refused to let fear or doubt stop him. When the day of the concert finally arrived, the boy's heart raced. The hall was small but filled with people eager to listen. He stood backstage, gripping his violin tightly, and took a deep breath. Memories of the streets, the hunger, and the laughter of strangers flashed through his mind. He remembered why he had started playing in the first place, and the memory gave him strength. As he stepped onto the stage, the lights shining down and the audience waiting silently, the boy felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. He lifted his violin and drew the bow across the strings. The first notes were soft, almost tentative, but as he played, they grew stronger, richer, more expressive. The audience was captivated, listening to the story of a boy who had faced hunger and ridicule but refused to give up. Each note was filled with emotion, hope, and resilience. By the end of the performance, the audience erupted in applause. The boy felt a rush of joy, relief, and pride. He had done more than survive. He had connected with people, moved them, and shared his story in a way that no words could. For the first time, he realized that his music could truly change lives, including his own. Returning home that night, he carefully put away his violin and reflected on the journey so far. The streets that had once been a place of struggle were now also a place of growth and recognition. The hunger, the mockery, and the doubt had shaped him, but they no longer defined him. He had discovered the power of music, the kindness of others, and the importance of never giving up on his dreams. As he lay down to sleep, he thought about the future. There would be more challenges, more obstacles, and more days of hunger and struggle. But he also knew that his talent, determination, and courage had carried him this far and would continue to do so. For the first time, the boy allowed himself to dream bigger, not just about surviving, but about thriving, performing for audiences far beyond the streets he had once played on, and inspiring others who faced challenges like his own. That night, the boy slept with a sense of purpose and hope he had never felt before. He had discovered that music could change everything, and that even a small, hungry child could shine if he refused to give up. The streets had been his first stage, but they were only the beginning of a journey that promised to reach far beyond the corners of his city, touching hearts and lives he had never imagined. The boy woke up that morning with a strange mix of excitement and calm. Today he would perform in a concert hall for the first time, not just for coins or scraps of food, but for an audience that had come to hear him, to appreciate him, and to witness his talent. The journey that had begun on a cold, crowded street corner, when he had held a violin and a cardboard sign reading, "I'll play for a piece of food," had finally led him here. He could hardly believe it, yet the memories of hunger, laughter, and struggle reminded him how far he had come. He dressed carefully, making sure his clothes were neat, though simple. He packed his violin in its case, checking it thoroughly, and walked to the hall with a steady determination. Every step was a reminder of the streets he had played on, the cold nights, the empty stomach, and the countless hours of practice that had brought him here. The lessons, the mentorship, the encouragement of those who believed in him, all of it, had shaped the boy into the musician he was becoming. When he arrived at the hall, he was stunned. The room was large, with polished wooden floors, bright lights, and rows upon rows of seats filled with people. The audience waited silently, their eyes on the stage. Backstage, he could hear the soft murmur of voices, the occasional tuning of instruments, and the gentle rustle of music sheets. He felt a flutter of nervousness, but it was nothing compared to the fear and uncertainty he had felt on the streets. Here, people had come to listen. They wanted to hear him. Taking a deep breath, the boy stepped onto the stage. The lights shone down on him, and the quiet expectation of the audience filled the air. He lifted his violin and began to play. At first, the notes were soft, almost cautious, as he adjusted to the space and the moment. But soon the music poured out, rich and full, carrying the years of struggle, hope, and determination that had shaped him. Each note told a story. The hunger he had felt, the laughter of strangers, the small acts of kindness that had kept him going, and the dream of something greater. The audience was captivated. They listened in silence, letting the melody wash over them. Some closed their eyes, imagining the boy's journey, feeling the emotion behind every note. Others leaned forward, mesmerized by the skill and the depth of expression in his playing. The boy felt something remarkable as he played. He was no longer just surviving, no longer just a child asking for scraps of food. He was communicating, connecting, inspiring. The music was a bridge between his past and his future, between his struggles and the hearts of those listening. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. People rose from their seats, clapping and cheering, some with tears in their eyes. The boy stood for a moment, overwhelmed by the sound, by the recognition, by the realization that he had truly arrived. He had not only played music, he had shared a piece of his soul. For the first time he felt the full weight and joy of his journey. The streets, the hunger, the mockery, and the long hours of practice had all led to this moment. After the concert, many people approached him. Some praised his technique, others the emotion in his playing. One person asked for his autograph, another wanted a picture. But more importantly, they spoke to him about his story, about how a child who had once played for scraps of food had now touched so many lives. The boy listened quietly, grateful for the recognition, but he never forgot the lessons of humility he had learned on the streets. He remembered the laughter, the hunger, and the small acts of kindness that had sustained him. And he knew that those experiences had made him who he was. The woman who had first mentored him was there, smiling proudly. She reminded him that this was only the beginning, that talent alone was not enough, and that dedication, discipline, and passion would continue to guide him. She encouraged him to keep practicing, to continue performing, and to help others whenever he could. The boy nodded, understanding fully that the journey of music was endless, that each day brought new challenges and opportunities, and that he had the power to shape not just his own life, but the lives of others through his music. In the weeks and months that followed, the boy's life changed dramatically. He was invited to perform at more venues, from small community events to larger halls. His story was shared in newspapers, blogs, and social media, inspiring people across the city and beyond. He continued to play on the streets occasionally, but now the experience was different. People no longer laughed or ignored him. They stopped to listen, to offer encouragement, and to acknowledge the journey that had brought him here. His music was no longer just a tool for survival, it was a gift that he could share freely, a language that spoke to the hearts of others. Despite the growing recognition, the boy never forgot where he came from. He remembered the empty stomachs, the cold streets, and the nights when the only audience was the city itself. Those experiences shaped his character, his resilience, and his empathy. He began to visit other children who were struggling, sharing music, encouragement, and lessons whenever he could. He wanted to make sure that no child felt invisible, hungry, or powerless. He knew that talent could open doors, but that kindness and mentorship could change lives. Through these experiences, the boy learned something profound. Success was not just about applause, recognition, or performing in grand halls. Success was about perseverance, about rising above circumstances, and about using one's gifts to make a positive impact. The violin, once a tool for survival, had become a bridge to a brighter future. It allowed him to tell his story, inspire others, and create opportunities that he could never have imagined as a hungry child on the streets. As he grew older, his skills continued to flourish. He learned new techniques, mastered complex pieces, and developed a style that was uniquely his own. He performed internationally, sharing his music with people from all walks of life. But no matter how far he traveled or how many audiences he played for, he never forgot the streets, the cardboard sign, or the lessons learned through struggle and perseverance. Those early experiences gave his music depth, emotion, and authenticity that touched people in ways no formal training could teach. At the same time, he remained humble and grateful. He knew that his journey was possible because of the people who had helped him along the way, the woman who first mentored him, the strangers who offered kindness, and the small community that had stopped to listen when he played for scraps of food. Every note he played carried a piece of their support, and he dedicated his success to them. Eventually, he decided to establish a small foundation to help underprivileged children learn music. He wanted others to have the chance he had received, to find hope and opportunity through their own talents. The foundation offered lessons, instruments, and mentorship, ensuring that music could reach those who needed it most. He understood that not every child had the chance to perform in concert halls, but every child deserved to discover the joy and power of music. Looking back on his journey, the boy reflected on how far he had come. From playing on a cold street corner for a piece of food to performing in grand concert halls and inspiring thousands, his life had been transformed by talent, courage, perseverance, and the kindness of others. He realized that the laughter, hunger, and struggle he had endured were not obstacles, but stepping stones that shaped him into the musician and person he had become. One evening, after a long day of practice and preparation for another performance, he sat quietly in his room, holding his violin. He thought about the little boy who had walked the streets, hungry and uncertain, carrying only a worn instrument and a dream. He smiled softly, realizing that every struggle, every hardship, and every moment of doubt had led him to this point. The music he played now was not just a reflection of his skill, but a reflection of his journey, his resilience, and his heart. And so, the boy who had once played for a piece of food became a symbol of hope and inspiration. His story reminded people that talent could emerge from the most unlikely places, that perseverance could overcome hardship, and that small acts of kindness could change lives. He had transformed not only his own future, but also the future of countless others, proving that even the humblest beginnings could lead to greatness when combined with courage, determination, and heart. The streets where he had once played were no longer just a memory, they were a foundation, a starting point for a life that had grown far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The violin that had been his companion through hunger and struggle was now a tool of inspiration, connecting hearts and touching lives across the world. And as he continued to play, he knew one truth above all: music had saved him, and now he could use it to save and inspire others, creating a legacy that would shine long after the notes had faded.